Today we're telling you about a very confusing crime that took place in Spain. This case became so well known that it was even made into a film. But the controversy is not yet resolved. Many believe that the outcome of the case was a miscarriage of justice. Rosario Porto and her husband from Soastra were affluent people. Rosario's father was an influential honorary consul of France, and her mother was an art teacher. Rosario followed in her father's footsteps and became a successful lawyer. In 197, she was appointed as the consul of France, inheriting this position from her father. Alfonso was a well-known journalist. In 1996, the couple married and moved into a large apartment that occupied an entire floor of a house in the upscale area of the Spanish city of Santiago de Compostela. Rosario suffered from lupus erythematosus, so doctors advised her against getting pregnant. Therefore, they decided to adopt a little girl who had been abandoned by her parents due to the vicissitudes of fate. In Spain, there were significant difficulties when they were a little over 30. The family decided to go to China to adopt a child. After overcoming many bureaucratic hurdles, they managed to end up in an orphanage. Rosario was charmed by the new, months-old girl from the first second. The couple needed 2 weeks in China to resolve all difficulties and officially adopt the girl. On the return flight to Spain, the documents identified the girl as Assunta Yongfang. An unusual situation, as Assunta was one of the first Chinese adoptive children in the Oberth region. Seemingly, she was very fortunate to live in a respected and wealthy family. Unfortunately, the joy of this reunion was short-lived. Assunta was a very talented girl. She was an excellent student who learned several languages, attended ballet lessons, and went to a music school. It seemed her parents wanted to give her every chance. On July 4, 2013, Rosario and her daughter, the 12-year-old Assunta, went to the beach to cool off on a hot day. The girl began to tell a frightening story about a creepy man dressed in black with a mask and gloves who had tried to strangle her the night before. The longer she spoke, the more she lost control of herself and eventually burst into tears. Her mother knew about it. She was there, but for some reason, the woman didn't even go to the police. At 10:30 p.m. on September 21, 2013, Rosario and Alfonso were at the police station, but for another reason. They reported that their 12-year-old daughter had been missing for several hours. The woman, prompted by Alfonso, told the story of the child from a nighttime attack that had occurred 2.5 months earlier. Given this background, the parents feared that an intruder had broken into the house again and something irreplaceable had happened to their daughter, probably kidnapping. The man was sure she was no longer alive. They pleaded with the police to act as quickly as possible. On the morning of September 22nd, 2 men were driving through a wooded area, both on their way back from a bar. Suddenly, the driver stopped and reported that he had noticed something strange in the woods. Not knowing what was going on, he turned the car with its headlights towards the woods and told his friend that he felt someone was watching him. But he was not afraid, probably because he had been drinking. Thus, he got out of the car, took a few steps towards the woods, and found himself among the trees. In the light of the car headlights, the driver saw something on the ground that looked like a doll, but as he got closer, he recognized it as a girl. The child was tied up. Her clothing seemed pulled up and muddy. The man checked her pulse. The girl was dead. The desperate young man went to the police. Assunta was identified. She had died just a week before her 13th birthday. The police searched the area near the body and found the dead teenager's cell phone, on which there were some rather strange photos. Several pictures were left showing her tightly wrapped like a baby, with wide-open eyes. Some forensic scientists believed her pupils were dilated, which could indicate the ingestion of illegal substances or drugs. Even more disturbing photos showed the schoolgirl in quite provocative clothing with bright, colorful makeup, wearing fishnet stockings, and in a provocative pose on a sofa. Here, too, her eyes were wide open, and her pupils dilated. She seemed out of her mind. The pictures ended up on the internet, went viral, and sparked a wave of public outrage over the treatment of the girl. According to her parents, the last day of her life was a perfectly normal day when nothing special happened. But then she suddenly disappeared and was found dead a few hours after her parents had reported her missing. On that fateful day, the girl had visited her father and then ran back under the pretext that she did not want to miss The Simpsons. About 19 hours after this meeting, Rosario returned from work and saw her daughter in her room, where she was spreading her books on the floor to do her homework. The woman suspected nothing and simply drove to the cottage about half an hour away. She wanted to take her swimwear and some clothes because she had planned a beach vacation for the next day. Rosario returned around 9:30 p.m. At this point, Assunta was no longer in the apartment. The adoptive mother was worried because the girl had not called or announced that she would be on her way, which was untypical for her. But she thought the girl might have gone to a friend's house, although it was already late. The woman called the teenager's friends and her husband, but it turned out that no one had seen Assunta. Of course, the mother was considered the last person to have seen the girl alive, and thus she was among the first to arouse the interest of the investigators and to be brought in for questioning. In conversation with law enforcement authorities, Rosario recalled details from the night of July 4th when the first attack occurred. Assunta had locked the front door when they returned from shopping together and accidentally left the key in the lock. Her mother did not notice this circumstance, and both went to bed. Unexpectedly, Rosario woke up around 3 a.m. and heard cries for help. Alfonso was not with them at the time, and no one came to help. She went into her daughter's room where she saw the silhouette of a large man who seemed to be pressing his arm down and appeared to be trying to strangle the girl. The mother rushed at the attacker, but he was a strong man and easily threw her back against the wall. Fortunately, he injured no one and simply ran away. Rosario described him as a sturdy man in black of middle age. He wore a mask and gloves, making it impossible to give a more detailed description. Assunta told her friend about the incident and even sent her some photos of herself with red marks on her neck. The father said the girl had been having problems with depression for a long time and had even taken special medication prescribed by a doctor. This was confirmed as Assunta communicated with her friends and shared her concerns with them. However, the last dialogues on this topic were quite positive. The girl confirmed that she was feeling much better. Rosario claimed that after the attack, she had not tried to find out the truth. The woman referred to the difficult emotional state of the child and claimed she was afraid to upset Assunta, which would inevitably happen if she went to the police. However, this was not a convincing excuse. Years before the tragedy, the girl had even been admitted to a psychiatric hospital because she had repeatedly spoken of intentions to commit suicide. Assunta was very tired due to the overload at school and in tutoring, leading to breakdowns. The family had a difficult relationship with each other, but the parents managed to smooth things over and come to an agreement with the girl, at least they said so themselves. The girl's nanny told her that her mother had recently been very upset that Assunta no longer lived up to her ideals and had started to perform worse in school. The girl had become somewhat of a burden to Rosario, so she was looking for a way to get rid of her. After the investigators received this information, they decided to check the case immediately. First, they were interested in the cottage that Rosario had visited on the day the girl disappeared. Indeed, Assunta's body was found only 4 kilometers away. When the investigators arrived here, the woman did not seem to expect to see them. She rushed headlong upstairs, obviously trying to hide something. They caught up with her in the bathroom where Rosario was bent over a trash can. When one of the investigators looked inside, he saw a piece of orange rope, the same rope with which the victim's hands and feet had been tied. Also, there was a black mask and gloves. All items were taken for forensic examination. Unfortunately, no fingerprints or DNA were found. The 2 forensic scientists who had conducted the examination had not immediately measured the body temperature for fear of falsifying the evidence, so the exact time of death could not be determined, but Assunta was probably already dead for about 20 hours. It turned out that the cause of death was strangulation. Her mouth and nose had been covered with a soft object, probably a pillow, so she could no longer breathe and lost consciousness, after which she died. The most shocking thing was that the experts found a very high dose of lamb in the girl's blood. The content of 22 pills was found, which is 9 times the adult dose. 8 tests were conducted, and it turned out that this was not the first time. She had already suffered a similar overdose 3 months before her death, at the time of the first break-in. It is worth noting that an overdose of this medication leads to amnesia and the inability to control muscles and movements. It was used to treat anxiety disorders and insomnia. The police quickly found out that Rosario took it to combat depression, while it had not been prescribed to Assunta. Why she took the medication, no one could explain. According to the mother, the perpetrators had drugged the girl with the medication so she would not remember the events. The investigators began a comprehensive review of the surveillance cameras in the area, hoping to trace the girl's movements on that fateful day. At around 2 p.m., Assunta visited her father. At 5:21 p.m., the girl returned home. At 5:28 p.m., her mother arrived. Another camera at a gas station recorded at 6:20 p.m. a green Mercedes that belonged to Rosario, as she admitted. The car was heading towards the cottage, but it was obvious that a girl was sitting next to the driver, identified as the woman's adoptive daughter. They drove in the direction where Assunta's body was later found, completely contradicting the woman's earlier statements. Rosario automatically became the main suspect in this murder case. Thus, the woman found herself under interrogation again. She explained her lies with fear and shame that her adoptive daughter had disappeared under her care. Now she told a new version of the events, according to which they went shopping for swimwear together. But Assunta did not want to enter the cottage when they arrived. The student decided to wait in the car while her mother took care of everything necessary and also did a few errands. But it took a long time, and the girl asked to be driven home to do her homework and rest. Rosario agreed and drove her back, but dropped her off 5 minutes walk from the house, so she wouldn't have to drive through the narrow streets and curves with the car. The woman was worried that her daughter had not come home and had been attacked on the street. When she returned and did not find her daughter at home, she immediately took action and asked her husband for help. They drove to the police station. The man claimed he had been at home all day and had nothing to do with the incident. The police officers checked the surveillance footage of streets in the area of Santiago and could not determine when Rosario had driven her daughter back. They only found footage showing Rosario leaving the cottage alone around 9 p.m. There were many controversies and contradictions in this story. Rosario herself even appeared somewhat arrogant. In the eyes of the investigators, she was cold and did not seem to regret the loss of her child at all. She continued to insist that the large man in black had something to do with it. When the police spoke to the family's neighbors, one of them said that on the night in July when Assunta was first attacked, he had heard screams. He noticed a strange detail. Since the intruder had entered the apartment, the dogs living nearby should have barked. However, the animals were quiet, suggesting that the perpetrator was a frequent visitor and the animals knew him. All in all, the situation looked dubious and made Assunta's parents increasingly suspicious. The police considered 2 versions of the first break-in. Some believed it was an invention of the mother. Others thought it was the first attempt at murder. Hardly anyone believed that it was actually an outsider, as there were no signs of forced entry or other people who had broken in. On September 24th, the parents held a funeral. Rosario and Alfonso behaved quite strangely, even taking selfies in front of the coffin. Due to the lies in the witness statements, the woman was arrested after the funeral. By this time, the investigators had already figured out what the motive for the murder might have been. Witnesses were found who reported events that began 9 months before the tragedy and could have been the trigger for the bloody dispute. It was found that Rosario had started a relationship with a real estate agent named Manuel Garcia in January 2013, whom she had approached for the sale of properties. The man was married and made it clear that he would not leave his family. For him, it was just an affair, but Rosario agreed, and the secret relationship continued. During the same period, Her relationship with her husband deteriorated rapidly. She called Alphonse boring and considered him a loser who simultaneously had too high an opinion of himself. The woman described him as unfeeling and calculating, while the lover was the complete opposite. She was sure that her husband would face financial ruin in the event of a separation. The husband saw a message from the lover on Rosario's phone, so they divorced in February 2013. Rosario and the girl continued to live in the apartment. She continued her business and visited the cottage. Custody of the girl was transferred to the mother at Asuna's request. The father had the right to see his daughter. Assun lived between the apartments of her father and her mother. Many noticed that the girl always stayed close to her mother, while her father was not so warm. Nevertheless, there were signs that the man was trying to build a relationship with the girl. He repeatedly told his ex-wife that they would be forever connected through their adoptive daughter. Could the desire to be completely free from her ex-husband have doomed an innocent child? It became known that Rosario was forced to break up with her lover, Manuel Garcia, in early summer. At that time, Rosario's condition deteriorated, and Alfonso seized the opportunity and took his wife's word to separate from her lover in return for taking care of his daughter while she was in the hospital. However, it became known that Rosario broke her promise on September 21st, spending most of the day with her lover and only returning home in the evening to meet Assunta. This is a very interesting fact when you think that the girl was murdered shortly afterward. Manuel had no intention of leaving his family for his mistress, as the man was empathetic and friendly. So the police considered the theory that Rosario might have tried to manipulate the man with the death of the girl. She was aware that such a loss would evoke sympathy in him and enable a bond with Manuel. This assumption was one of dozens expressed during the investigation. At this point, the suspect was already in full contact with her lawyer. The defender insisted on an important argument that refuted the version of the investigation. Male fluid was found on the deceased's clothing, so clearly a man was involved in the case. Either an accomplice or Rosario was telling the truth. It was not ruled out that the mother was not really involved in the murder, but this version was considered unlikely. This strong argument had to be refuted. The police took up the case with renewed vigor. The material for analysis was collected, and now they had to wait for the results. Primarily, they were interested in the origin of the male fluid samples on the victim's body. In the meantime, there were several possibilities, e.g., that the father was the attacker, but even more interesting was Manuel Garcia, the lover. However, he had an alibi and had no strong motive to kill the girl, so he was quickly crossed off the list of suspects. Unexpectedly, it turned out that the found DNA prints belonged to a complete stranger named Ramiro. He was a Colombian citizen living in Madrid, practically 6 hours by car from Santiago, where the tragedy occurred. All this seemed strange. The police officers confronted him, and the man went on the defensive from the beginning. He said he had no idea who Asuna was. He emphasized that he had never been in that city and had nothing to do with the murder. Ramiro had a confirmed alibi. He had had dinner with his girlfriend in a Madrid restaurant and was recorded by surveillance cameras. At that time, it was not possible to accuse the man of anything. He seemed honest. Even if one assumed that he had actually traveled to another city to commit the crime, this did not explain why the girl had not taken the prescription medication for months before the incident. Further tests revealed that only some of the found DNA traces belonged to Ramiro. The laboratory officials speculated that the data matched his DNA because the samples were of poor quality or the staff had not maintained complete sterility when handling the instruments, and therefore they were contaminated. The samples might have been intentionally placed by someone to confuse the investigation. At this stage, there were far more questions than answers. The investigators made the most unlikely assumptions, and even the parents' behavior contributed to this, as they seemed not to care at all about what happened to the girl. Technically, Rosario was the last person to have seen Assunta alive, but many doubted that she could have managed everything alone since she was quite petite and did not appear very strong, leading investigators to doubt her physical ability to recover Assunta's body. Using cell phone towers, the police tried to determine where the girl's parents were at the time of the murder. It turned out that both had their cell phones turned off on this fateful day. This fact puzzled the police and seemed suspicious. The parents claimed it was a mere coincidence that both phones were off at the same time and insisted there was no malicious intent. Regarding the medication, Rosario mentioned that she had used a prescription a doctor had given her for panic attacks, but when the document expired, she continued to buy the drugs illegally. The lax legislation regarding such medications contributed to this issue. The local pharmacist, who was friends with Rosario, allowed her to obtain the pills without any problems. However, after speaking with this acquaintance, the investigators learned that the mother of the murdered girl had requested the pills only on July 5th, a day after the burglar had broken into the house and attacked the girl. Moreover, her husband had recently bought large quantities of the medications. Due to all these circumstances, the investigators decided to arrest Alphonse. As it turned out, some teachers of the girl had noticed oddities in her behavior shortly before the tragedy. One day, Assunta came with her father to violin lessons, acting as if she could not control herself. Alfonso claimed his daughter was simply under the influence of allergy medications. The teachers confirmed that she had always been very reserved and never talked about her life. Over time, the incident with her drowsiness repeated itself, but the parents always found an excuse, usually referring to the student's health condition. The teacher doubted and did not believe the parents of the adopted girl when contacted by the police. She described Assunta's symptoms and her behavior exactly as the list of side effects of the illegal substances. When the father picked up his daughter, the teacher described what had happened, and her suspicion only increased when the man changed the story and now claimed the daughter had taken a different medication. All this seemed more and more like a lie and was clearly suspicious. The last incident occurred 2 days before the tragedy. On that day, Rosario went to the teacher and said that her daughter could not come to class due to a strong reaction to the prescribed medications. After this statement, the investigators had no more doubts that the adoptive parents knew about the medications and were trying to poison the child. In August 2013, when the mother was plagued by depression, the girl was sent on a vacation to the countryside with her nanny. She spent there a month, and her parents called regularly but never visited Assunta. Without her parents, the girl seemed cheerful, happy, and carefree. Throughout all phases of this case, the same fact kept reappearing. Alfonso desperately wanted to restore the relationship with his former wife. In June 2013, just 2 months before the tragedy, Rosario was admitted to the hospital with a nervous breakdown. During this time, Alfonso even moved back in. In some ways, the man was pleased when his wish to be reunited with his family seemed to be coming true. During this time, Rosario stopped seeing her lover. Her husband visited her in the hospital and took care of her after she was discharged. It seemed that things in the family were starting to improve, but as it later turned out, she lied as she continued to communicate with her lover and saw him on the day of the murder. In light of the uncovered facts, the new assumption of the investigation was Alfonso's revenge. Perhaps he wanted to inflict even more pain on Rosario than he had suffered because of her infidelity. This could explain how the orange rope ended up in the urn at the country house. It was simply placed there by Alfonso. But why did she know about these items and was so frightened when the police visited her and ran directly to the trash can? Probably she knew about it and was an accomplice. It was obvious that the ex-husband was a rather vindictive person. He even tried to call Manuel Garcia's wife to tell her about his extramarital affair. The police uncovered an important pattern. When the man was in the house with his ex-wife and their daughter, Assunta was always drugged with some medication, but Alfonso refused to admit this. He claimed he was innocent. After their arrest, Rosario's behavior was erratic, from hysterical to depressive, while Alfonso was calm and composed, constantly trying to reassure her, telling her that they just needed to love and support each other, and that it would all be over soon. Despite all his convincing words, the police officers noticed how cold the man was. After some time, it was possible to discover the storage medium used by Alfonso. It turned out that the hard drive of his laptop had been completely replaced. Experts were able to calculate that more than 500,000 photos and videos were stored on it, probably compromising material. The police found out that Alfonso had an unhealthy interest in Asian girls. On his social media page, there were indications of dozens of dates and correspondence with Asian girls. According to most investigators who saw the photos of the accounts, these girls were underage. Furthermore, the man was exclusively interested in Asian girls with the most childlike appearance. Later, a woman who owned an escort agency approached the police station. According to her confession, Alfonso regularly visited the establishment, always only ordering Asian girls and demanding that they dress like schoolgirls. Even the wife knew about this weakness. The photos of the murdered girl in revealing clothing obtained in this context looked even more compromising. In pretrial detention, they discussed interesting topics, c.g., whether they had managed to eliminate all evidence, but the prosecutor pointed out how cruelly this calm, sensible man had treated his former wife. The accusation stated that the perpetrators covered for each other. In reality, both were involved in the child's death, probably burdened by an adopted daughter after the couple's separation, which could have been a motive for the crime. Their behavior and the witness statements spoke volumes about this. The defendants did not cooperate with the investigations and refused to talk without their lawyer. Later, on the advice of their defenders, they no longer commented on the tragedy at all. During this whole time, the media were in an uproar. It was about rich people involved in something so dirty that the food for rumors seemed endless. Viral photos played a big role in this, discussed all over the internet, also internationally. Forensic psychiatrists played an important role in the investigations. After analyzing the behavior of the adoptive parents, the experts saw two narcissists with similar personality disorders, caught by the power of money, pampered and capricious. Apparently, they had only adopted Assunta to present a loving family under pressure from Rosario's parents. She became a toy for them, unfortunately, first exploited and then disposed of when she was no longer needed. On the side of the prosecution stood a witness, a 15-year-old acquaintance of Assunta. Although Alfonso claimed that he had not left the house all day until the evening on the day of the murder, this turned out to be a lie. The girl saw him with Assunta around 6 p.m. in front of Rosario's house. This was later confirmed by camera recordings. Also, at 9 p.m., after the disappearance but before the call from Rosario, he was seen on the cameras. Contradictory facts added to the list of evidence against the couple. Indeed, the trial was very controversial. Even the judge's behavior was questioned. Many believed he only wanted to become famous, and this suspicion turned out to be unfounded. Sometime after the end of the trial, he wrote a book about Assunta, although it was really just an attempt to become famous. The defendants had their supporters. Relatives and neighbors had watched for years as the foster parents tried to create better conditions for the child. They had money, ambition, and difficult characters, but those close to them saw that they did everything for Assunta. Many still believe that the outcome of the trial, despite all the oddities in their behavior, was a miscarriage of justice. This opinion is especially widespread among those engaged outside of Spain. The defendants themselves did not plead guilty during the trial. During the trial, Alfonso behaved calmly and sensibly, while Rosario constantly cried and fell into hysteria, confused in her statement and justifying her behavior with the effect of medications. Rosario's cousin spoke during the trial and told interesting facts. The parents of the accused had died suddenly at home within 7 months of each other in the years 2011 and 2012, before the death of Assunta. The cousin suspected that Rosario was involved in the murder of both the parents and the daughter to gain sole possession of the entire estate. The defense attorney rejected this assumption. Rosario's mother was 77 and her father 88 years old. They had died in their beds of old age, and nothing suspicious had been found during the medical examination. However, their bodies, like Assunta's, had been cremated, and the remains could not be examined to determine a violent death. The prosecution, on the other hand, insisted that the child's parents were real psychopaths. Alfonso was clearly a pedophile who drugged his adoptive daughter and then lived out his fantasies. As the girl got older, she could remember these events and report them, so they decided to get rid of her as a threat. The theory was supported by numerous photos and evidence that the man had a pathological attraction to underage Asian girls. Probably Rosario was also involved, or she knew about it and still covered up her husband's dirty deeds. Perhaps she also simply decided to get rid of the girl because she was no longer needed and did it with Alfonso. On October 30th, 2015, the court found them guilty and sentenced them to 18 years in prison each. After serving the sentence, both filed appeals, which were denied. On November 18, 2020, Rosario was found dead in her prison cell with a belt around her neck. It turned out that it was her third attempt to voluntarily end her life. Alfonso is still behind bars and continues to assert his innocence. The case has not only caused a great stir in Spain, but also in China, sparking a fierce controversy over the granting of custody to foreign nationals. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourself. Not all dreams are meant to come true. Sometimes a person simply doesn't live up to their high expectations. Of course, not everyone can admit that. It's much easier to blame everyone else for one's own failures. Sometimes this leads to unjustified, cruel acts of revenge, as in our story today. Omaha is the largest city in the U.S. state of Nebraska and lies on the banks of the Missouri River. It is home to the famous Creighton University Medical Complex, which attracts many people. Some seek high-quality medical services, while others dream of working at this facility. However, not everyone can meet the high standards, which has led to several bloody tragedies. Bill and Claire were the parents of 11-year-old Thomas Hunter, one of 4 children in their family. They lived in an upscale area of Dundee, where their beautiful, comfortable house was located. It was a safe and quiet place where the crime rate tended toward zero. In the past, there had been no sensational crimes, and the neighborhood had a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone. Therefore, the massacre was a real shock for everyone. On March 13, 2008, Dr. Claire Hunter was at a conference in Hawaii, and her husband Bill was working in a laboratory. Their 11-year-old son Thomas had come home from school. He was a bright boy with a penchant for the sciences, especially mathematics. The schoolboy was the youngest son of the family and was in the 6th grade. In the absence of his parents, he was cared for by a housekeeper and part-time nanny named Shirley Sherman. This woman was a mother, caregiver, and grandmother of 5 grandchildren. She was described as a very hardworking woman who loved children and her work. She was a real asset to the Hunters, as she was good with the children. Thomas was very attached to her, and the busy parents trusted her completely. When Thomas returned from school, Shirley offered him a snack and a break before he started his homework. The boy agreed, and then went to the playroom in the basement where his game console was located. At 5 p.m., Bill Hunter left the laboratory of Creighton University and headed home. The drive took only 10 minutes by car. He had no idea what had happened in his absence, but was worried because he couldn't reach his son. He then tried to reach the babysitter, but she persistently ignored the calls. The whole situation was strange. When Bill arrived at the family home, he entered through the back door and was immediately confronted by Shirley. The 57-year-old woman was lying on the floor in a pool of her own blood. Only a few meters away lay Thomas, who was also dead. The experienced doctor immediately recognized that it was no longer possible to help them and called emergency services at 911. The dispatcher asked him to leave the house and wait outside for the police officers. When the police officers arrived at the house, they saw the 2 victims in a pool of blood. Judging by the large amount of blood, they might have died from blood loss. The investigators immediately began to look around the property and decided to talk to Bill. It was obvious that the deceased had been taken by surprise, but there were no signs of forced entry. Apparently, Shirley had let her attacker into the house, where he struck her down from behind. There was a bucket with cleaning supplies and water that the housekeeper had been using before Dr. Hunter's arrival. The perpetrator probably caught her while she was tidying up before she was finished. In the basement, a game console was found that had been left on. There were also the student soda and chips. Both victims had been stabbed, and several stabbing and cutting tools were left near the bodies. During the search of the premises, several other knives were found in the backyard of the house. Despite a thorough search, the police could not find any evidence that could help identify the perpetrator. The motive for the attack was completely unclear. Nothing was stolen from the house. The perpetrator didn't even search for anything. There was no forced entry. All the furniture was intact, and the family's belongings were untouched. In Shirley's handbag, the investigators found $833 in cash, which did not interest the perpetrator. In fact, her personal belongings were not even searched. Furthermore, there was a large amount of valuables in the Hunter's home, all of which were left in their place. According to the investigators, the picture did not add up at all. Thomas could not have any enemies, as he was a sociable and quiet boy who was not involved in any trouble, and besides, his age was not a time when one would get involved with bad company. Shirley was a friendly woman who also had no enemies. For the police, it was unclear what motive the attacker could have had. Adding to this gloomy picture was the fact that a brutal murder had occurred in a city where such a thing had never happened before. After a thorough examination of the crime scene, the forensic doctors could find no traces of the perpetrator's DNA. A motive was never established, and no obvious suspects were found. The police officers turned their attention to Bill, who had found the bodies in his home. However, it turned out that he had a confirmed alibi. He was at work at the time of the attack, as was his wife. There were practically no clues. One hint was an unknown car that a neighbor had seen in the area. It was a silver Honda SUV with license plates from another state. The woman was not only drawn to the car, but also to its driver. He stopped near the street where the Hunter's house was located, took his bag out of the passenger seat, and got out. The tall adult man confidently walked down the street toward the Hunter's house, as if he had a good sense of direction and knew where he needed to go. The woman gave a detailed description of everything she saw, but the composite sketch did not match any of the criminals in the police database. The investigators played out one scenario after another, but could not make sense of what had happened. The police tried to find out whether Shirley could have been the target of the attack, or whether it was Thomas who had a conflict online or in a game. Possibly, it was an act of revenge by someone who had it in for the parents of the murdered student. It was obvious that the attack was carried out with great anger and hatred, suggesting a personal motive specifically directed against these victims. The attack was clearly not a random act. Unfortunately, Bill and Claire were unable to name possible suspects from their inner circle. They claimed they had no enemies capable of such brutality. The police officers agreed on the version that the murder was committed out of revenge by someone targeting the parents of the murdered student. The investigators decided to check the employees of Creighton University who had been dismissed in recent years. There were only a few such cases. The last one in question was Anthony Garcia, a longtime employee of the medical center. Bill Hunter had dismissed him back in 2001, but wasn't sure if the man could be connected to the events. The reason for the dismissal was trivial. The doctor's abilities did not meet the high standards of the medical center. According to Bill, Anthony left quietly and without argument. He was aware that he did not reach the level of his colleagues and therefore was not suitable for the role of a brutal murderer. Every assumption of the police officers led to a dead end. Eventually, the investigators began to believe that this case would remain unsolved. In their desperation, Shirley Sherman's family offered a reward of $50,000 for information on the case and hired a private detective. The investigators kept returning to the material collected at the scene of the double murder. But even with the most modern analytical methods, they could find neither DNA nor other traces of the perpetrator. It was obvious that the attacker had been very careful and had worn gloves to leave no traces. It was clear that Thomas had been attacked first. However, nothing was found that could have provoked aggression, let alone the desire to massacre a schoolboy. Even after weeks of investigations, the police could not say whom the perpetrator had targeted, but it was suspected that it was a targeted attack, as the suspect had purposefully approached the house where the victims lived. The investigations finally came to a complete standstill because the investigators simply did not know which direction to go. They continued to pursue leads in vain, and the situation improved only in May 2013. On May 12, 2013, the Butcher family met with old friends in a restaurant. This meeting dragged on, and everyone went home a little later. The Buttras took a short drive to their house. On the way, they received a message from the alarm system that the door to the house was open. When they arrived, they immediately saw that the door was ajar, a clear sign of a break-in. Upon entering, no one was in the house. It was obvious that the burglar had gone into the basement, as that door was also ajar. The couple looked around the rooms and were surprised that nothing was missing. It was as if a stranger had entered the house and left again. They decided not to file a report with the police since nothing had been stolen. Later, however, it turned out that the burglar was not interested in valuables. Only a few kilometers away lived Mary and Roger Brumbach, who were far less fortunate. The Buttras had stayed at the restaurant longer, so they missed the man who had broken into their house, effectively saving their lives. Roger and Mary were less fortunate, as they were at home at the time. As the perpetrator left the Butcher's house, he made his way to theirs. At this time, Roger was painting the interior of the house, as the elderly couple was preparing to sell their belongings and move. The Brumbachs wanted to retire and relocate. Shortly before the incident, the couple had a video call with their daughter. Only a few minutes after the end of the conversation, Roger heard a knock at the door. As soon as he opened the door to the uninvited guest, a shot rang out. But no one immediately learned of the massacre. 2 days later, a moving company arrived at the family's house. This meeting had been planned in advance, as the worker was supposed to help move the piano to the new house. But no one responded to his ringing. The man knew that his customers were elderly and thought they might not hear. So he tried to open the front door to call out to the owners. Surprisingly, it was unlocked. The worker suspected that something was wrong and notified the police. He did not enter the house to avoid contaminating the crime scene or tampering with possible evidence. A police patrol arrived within minutes. The officers found an expended shell casing between the double doors, and Roger Brumbach lay lifeless in the corridor. Judging by the degree of decomposition, he had been dead for several days. He had suffered a gunshot wound. Additionally, the police found a deep stab wound on the right side of his neck, just below the ear. The victim's wife was found in the living room on the ground floor. She too had suffered a fatal stab wound in the same area of the neck. The woman showed no gunshot wounds. The murderer seemed to have acted with certainty. He must have understood basic anatomy, as he killed the victims with a single, precise, and forceful blow. Mary had obviously tried desperately to defend herself against her attacker, as her arms showed deep knife marks typical of defensive wounds. Unfortunately, these couldn't save her from death. The most surprising aspect was the numerous knives the perpetrator had left at the crime scene. In this point, an analogy could be drawn to the murder 5 years prior at the Hunter's house. Again, nothing was stolen. The victims were decent people who had no obvious enemies. It seemed the perpetrator simply entered the house because he was out for blood. According to the investigators, this case painfully resembled the previous one, where the murderer had targeted a boy and his nanny. This could indicate a serial killer. Panic spread throughout the neighborhood. Many people drew parallels similar to those the police officers had made. People began to pressure the sheriff's department because they feared the perpetrator had been overlooked the first time due to incompetence. No one wanted another double murder. Given that the victims had no enemies, no resident of Omaha felt safe anymore. Both victims showed similar wounds on the right side of the neck, the same wounds that previous victims Thomas and Shirley had died from. Another important clue was found. All the victims' families included people who worked at Creighton Medical Center. Roger had spent most of his professional life treating childhood diseases and later dealt with Alzheimer's patients. Like his wife, he had no enemies. Both were first-class professionals with excellent track records, as well as friendly and caring people. It turned out that the deceased was not only a doctor at Creighton, but also worked in the same department as Thomas Hunter's father, namely in pathology. While Bill took care of patients, Roger was the supervisor. Obviously, the police not only noted similarities in the modus operandi and the weapons used, but also a clear connection to the pathology department of the local medical center. The unsolved case from 5 years ago seemed to inspire the murderer to strike again. The investigators felt it necessary to look for a man who may have been wronged by the medical center staff and was now seeking revenge. One day after the news of the elderly couple's murder, Dr. Chandra Butra reported to the police station and said that her house had been broken into and the alarm system had been triggered. The couple had heard of the Brumbach's murder and suspected they too could have become victims. As it turned out, they were also colleagues of Bill Hunter and Roger Brumbach, working in Creighton's pathology department. The connection was now undeniable. It quickly became clear that these individuals had the most influence over residents in the medical center's training program. Finally, the police had an important lead to advance the case. In investigating the third couple's house, a fingerprint was found on the doorknob that belonged neither to the couple nor to their acquaintances. It was left by the perpetrator. The investigators then went to Creighton Medical Center and obtained information about all participants in the training program since the year 2000. The name Anthony Garcia, who had been dismissed from pathology, resurfaced. One supervisor was Dr. Chandra Butra. The investigators decided to speak with her immediately. According to Chandra, Anthony was a promising student, but she did not like him personally. He did not learn well, did not perform tasks carefully, and liked to hurt people, which particularly upset everyone. After complaining about him several times, Chandra decided he should be dismissed. Bill and Roger agreed with her opinion. They were the ones who made the decision to dismiss Anthony. That seemed to have given him a motive. Thus, 3 people were responsible for his dismissal and had, in a sense, signed a death warrant for themselves and their relatives. Of course, this was only an assumption, but the police were confident they finally had a serious lead in the years-old case. A more thorough investigation was required. The investigators began by analyzing Anthony's personality. He was the eldest child of a middle-class family. His mother was a nurse and his father a postal worker. He played football and grew up in Almonte, California, a community an hour from Los Angeles. The investigators managed to locate his younger brother, Fernando Garcia. Their mother was born in Mexico. Their father was American and had fought in Vietnam. They described Anthony as a quiet and intelligent man who was anything but aggressive and violent. After graduating from the University of Utah Medical School, he wanted to become a neurosurgeon. According to his parents, Anthony went to St. Elizabeth's Medical Center in Utica, New York, in 1999 to realize his dream. Unfortunately, problems began to grow from this point in his history. The staff accused him of unprofessionalism and forced him to write a resignation letter 6 months later. Afterwards, he returned to his parents' home and, according to his mother, was never the same again. It seemed as if the young man was broken, but the first impression was deceptive. He did not give up, and in July 2000, he got a second chance at a residency in the pathology department at Creighton. It was a very prestigious position, and Anthony was enthusiastic and expected success. Unfortunately, he was also unable to fulfill his duties carefully here. He had serious problems with his studies. After numerous incidents and poor evaluations, he was dismissed in 2001. This seemed to be the end of his medical career. He returned to his parents, but according to them, Anthony never complained or blamed anyone for his failures. He was visibly affected by the events and said the hard work had overwhelmed him. The aspiring doctor did everything he could to be successful, but it didn't work out. After returning from Creighton, Anthony suffered from depression and migraines. It took a while for him to recover, and he even sought help at a psychiatric clinic, where doctors attributed everything to overwork and stress. It seemed there was no way into the medical field. As if by a miracle, however, Anthony Garcia received a third chance in 2003. He began working as a resident physician at the University of Illinois Hospital and received a state license. After that, he began searching for a job in the medical field and wandered across the country to find the right clinic. He changed many positions until he eventually ended up in a prison hospital. In every new state where he tried to obtain a medical license, his dismissal from Creighton became a major problem. Every time the event was discovered, he was rejected. Inquiries were made to the university, and each time he applied for a license, the answers were negative. He was described as an unreliable person with low qualifications. Naturally, Creighton became the stumbling block and the cause of all his failures. He thus had a strong motive for killing his tormentors: revenge. The investigators managed to find out that the aspiring doctor lived in Louisiana in February 2008. His application for a license was again rejected because of poor recommendations from Creighton. Less than 2 weeks later, Thomas Hunter and Shirley were brutally murdered. The investigators found out which vehicle Anthony had been driving at that time. It turned out that a silver Honda was registered to him, the same car type the Hunter's neighbor remembered. Finally, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. It became known that the suspected murderer had owned the car between 2007 and 2009. The police were certain that the massacre was committed by Anthony Garcia, whose resentment had built up 7 years before the first and 12 years before the second attack. Although the investigators immediately began to formulate a theory that viewed the failed doctor as the main suspect, his brother disagreed. His parents also did not believe the police. They described their son as the family's hope, a quiet and friendly person. The family pointed out that during his time at Creighton, several people had been dismissed and none had returned out of revenge. Anthony did not fit the role of a violent criminal who committed double murders with knives. By 2013, the main suspect had already left Omaha and was living in Indiana. On the eve of these events, he was dismissed again, this time from his position as a medical officer in a prison. Despite the apparent failure of his career, officers arriving at his house found a Ferrari in Garcia's driveway. He seemed to have no shortage of money and led an extravagant life. But that did not interest the investigators. They decided to speak to Anthony personally to find out where he was in May 2013. First, they decided to check the geolocation data of his mobile phone. It turned out that his phone was an hour's drive from the city on that day, later in Omaha itself. There, Anthony visited a restaurant and was recorded by several surveillance cameras buying beer and snacks. This information was obtained from his account statements. Unfortunately, the police did not manage to catch him at home. It was found that Anthony was on his way to Louisiana, which greatly worried the investigators. In their opinion, he could have committed another murder, as he kept blaming others for his unfulfilled goals. Considering that the damage to his career could have been caused by many during the time, he changed about a dozen jobs. Hundreds of people were in danger. On July 15, 2013, the Illinois State Police arrested the 40-year-old man matching a nationwide alert description. He was arrested at 8:30 a.m. at the wheel of a car. Anthony seemed drunk and behaved quite aggressively. In his vehicle, a pistol, a crowbar, and a sledgehammer were found. At about the same time, his house was searched. Investigators found his notes and numerous documents. These were sheets with notes. On one, the police saw the chilling words, "Garcias, we live, we die, we live, we die." It seemed his identity was far darker than family and friends had suspected. Among other things, Notes were found about the preparation of the murders, such as tape your fingers together, take a change of shoes. There were also documents spread out on the dining table, including his medical degree diploma and house deeds. He seemed to have carefully selected everything he wanted to dispose of. In the kitchen sink was a garbage bag containing various documents and similar notes that seemed to be underwater. The investigators arrived just in time as Anthony was trying to destroy them. The notes ranged from shopping lists to grim notes about torture and murder. In the sink, a dismissal letter from Dr. Chandra Butra was found, bearing the signatures of Bill Hunter and Roger Brumback. All this added to the prosecution's list of evidence. The investigations continued, and the investigators found one of the most important witnesses in this case. It was Cecilia Hoffman, who worked as a stripper in Anthony Garcia's favorite club in Indiana. He had been a regular customer for several months and had become known among the club's employees as a fairly wealthy man. Cecilia said that Anthony wanted to build a relationship with her and be more than just a customer, but she was against it. With all her might, she tried to distance herself from the strange man. She tried to make her admirer understand that they were not a couple. The dancer explained that she was into bad boys and that he was not her type. At that moment, Anthony made his shocking confession. The suspect told the stripper he had killed a boy and an older woman, with which Anthony Garcia tried to impress Cecilia. The failed doctor was then extradited to Omaha and formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder on July 23, 2013. Under state law, the committed atrocities were punishable by death. Anthony's defense attorney believed his client was innocent. He turned out to be one of the best lawyers, for whom the man's parents spent almost all their savings. On September 26, 2016, hearings began in the case of the 2 double murders. The prosecutor believed that the motive for the massacres was the desire for revenge over his dismissal, as Anthony blamed the doctors at Creighton for his professional failure. The lawyers tried to refute this by showing the jurors a recommendation letter written after the dismissal. In it, Dr. Hunter wrote that he did not want to take away Anthony's chance for a job. The letter said, "We have dismissed him, but we do not want him to be unemployed and destitute. We want him to rehabilitate and find another job." According to the defense attorney, the incident was not so traumatic that Anthony would have had the desire to kill the medical center's staff, let alone the boy and the nanny, who were not involved in the dismissal. The lawyer described Cecilia Hoffman as a liar who only wanted her share of fame. Since the woman was a stripper who, according to Anthony, was drunk at the time of her statement, the attorney insisted her words should not be believed. It was also proven that she was taking prescription medications, so she could have been addicted. The prosecution had enough evidence to convince the jurors otherwise. The murder weapon was found in his house. Ballistics proved it was the weapon used to shoot Roger Brumback. Additionally, DNA and fingerprints were found on the doorknob in the Butra's house that matched the defendant's profile, but he had never been in the couple's house, making it impossible to explain his DNA's presence there. The geolocation of his mobile phone showed that Anthony was indeed in Omaha at the time of the murders. He was traveling in a vehicle that a witness had seen. Furthermore, Anthony had a strong motive to take revenge on those who had ruined his medical career. He probably had not carefully planned his crimes. He simply found the addresses of the Hunter, Butra, and Brumback families and drove to them without studying their schedules. Unfortunately, in the first case, Anthony did not find the medical center staff present, but decided to take out his anger on those present in the house. In the second attempt, he had the misfortune of finding no one at home. In the third attempt, he caught Roger with his wife and killed them. The appearance of Anthony Garcia near the crime scene was considered by the defense as pure coincidence. They argued that Anthony had returned after his dismissal from the prison hospital because he wanted to find work in the area. During the trial, over 50 witnesses were questioned. The proceedings were adjourned for 15 days. Anthony himself refused to appear in court. During most of the trial, Garcia wore headphones and seemed to be sleeping. The jurors deliberated and, after 7 hours, unanimously found Anthony guilty of all 4 murders. In September 2018, a panel of 3 judges sentenced Anthony to death. The victims' families applauded the verdict. They had finally received justice. At the same time, it was a real shock for the Garcia family. The mother and father had lost their eldest son. They did not consider him guilty and argued he had grown up in a healthy environment among hardworking people, far from criminality, and now he was sentenced to death and awaiting execution on death row. Anthony immediately appealed and argued that his defense had been ineffective, but the appeal was rejected. Anthony broke off contact with his legal team and his family of his own accord. His family still does not believe in his guilt and believes that an innocent man is being executed. The Butcher family was the happiest about the outcome of this story. In fact, they escaped death only by luck. But nothing prevented the criminal from returning and carrying out his plan. Now the couple could finally live in peace. Thanks for watching, and take care. People without morals and honor can be a big problem even in everyday life. However, the protagonists of today's story went even further as they held significant power in their hands. We tell you how far ruthlessness and power given to unworthy individuals can take them. Donald was born on October 12, 1943, in New York, USA. He was a sporty, prominent man in his youth, the quarterback of his school football team, and the most popular boy in high school. After graduating from Princeton, Jeffrey studied medicine and completed an internship at a renowned medical center in New York City. He married Colette Stevenson, his high school sweetheart, and shortly after the wedding, their daughter Kimberly was born, who was 5 years old at the time of the events in question. 3 years later, Kristen was born into the family. After receiving training, the young man joined the Army and was later admitted to the famous Green Berets. Over the next 2 years, Jeff was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Their life, previously characterized by moves, eventually stabilized. They settled in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and lived in a house assigned to them by the state. Her husband came home from work at 1 p.m., took no more business trips, and Colette finally calmed down. The woman hoped that her husband would end his service in a few years, and then they would have their own house on a farm far from the hustle and bustle of the city. At the time of the tragedy, Colette was pregnant with their 3rd child. It seemed like the perfect story, but it was about to turn into one of the cruelest crimes in the history of the United States of America. At 3:30 a.m. on February 17, 1977, the Fayetteville Emergency Center received a call from a man posing as Captain McDonald. He informed the duty operator that there had been a brutal attack at his house. According to the man, his wife had been stabbed and possibly raped, and he could not say what had happened to his children. He asked for immediate help. The dispatcher immediately sent several police cars to the address, but could not send an ambulance until it was determined whether the victims needed one. On the way to the house, the police officers noticed a strange woman standing in the rain at 3:55 a.m. wearing a wide-brimmed hat. She did nothing but stand still as if waiting for something. However, the police officers had no time to be distracted by her and drove past her. Just a few minutes later, several military police officers arrived at the McDonald family's house. They were needed because one of the victims was a military member. The lights in the house were off, forcing the officers to enter through the back door. In the first room, they found 26-year-old Colette lifeless on the floor. The woman was blood-soaked, and judging by her body position, she might have been raped. Her face was severely disfigured, and her clothes were torn. She lay on her back, and next to her, crouching on the floor, lay her injured husband. As the first officer approached, Jeffrey immediately asked to check on his children because he heard their screams but could not reach them. One of the police officers searched the other rooms and first found 5-year-old Kimberly in the nursery. She had suffered several severe injuries that cost her life. In another room, 2-year-old Kristen lay on a bed with a large number of similar injuries and also showed no signs of life. Jeffrey was severely injured. He had stab wounds to the head and upper chest area. At some point, he lost consciousness, but a police officer revived him to find out what had happened. Heavily breathing, the man reported that 3 men and a woman had broken into his house, probably hippies. One of the strangers was black-skinned and wore a jacket with sergeant stripes. The woman he described looked exactly like the suspicious woman with the hat that the police had seen on the way to the house. Unfortunately, she was never found that night. An ambulance took Jeffrey away. He was the only member of the family to survive the night. All others tragically died. Jeffrey received first aid and was treated for his wounds, including a severe lung injury. The man was also sedated. Afterwards, the police officers could talk to the victim of the attack. According to his account, he and his wife had drunk a glass of orange liqueur that evening. He had to lie down on the sofa in the living room because his daughter had wet the bed next to him. He fell asleep in front of the TV, but suddenly woke up with severe pain. He was attacked without warning by 3 unknown men. The 4th person was a woman with a hat who just stood nearby, watching with a torch or candle in hand. To him, it looked like they were hippies under the influence of illegal substances. The woman gave orders, telling the men to kill the pigs. He could no longer see their faces because his eyes were smeared with blood. Jeffrey lost consciousness, and when he came to, he found his wife lifeless. He tried to give her first aid, but nothing worked. Jeffrey wanted to go to his children and try to help them, but he could not do so because of his injuries. Thus, he called the 911 emergency number. The Army's Criminal Investigation Department sent the least experienced investigator on duty to the crime scene. After examining the house, he concluded that the military survivor's story was fabricated. The 27-year-old Jeffrey's story with the hippies seemed implausible to the officer. He found no evidence of the presence of outsiders. After this decision by the investigator, all efforts of the investigation focused on proving Jeffrey's guilt. The father of the McDonald family was arrested, and the soldier was charged with triple premeditated murder. The trial turned into a disaster, which was clear from the start. The soldier's defense tried to find out how professionally the arriving military police had inspected the house. In cross-examination, it turned out that numerous irregularities had been committed, and the actions taken could have severely damaged the evidence and the crime scene. Indeed, the site was simply trampled, and it was very difficult to find traces of the perpetrators there. This allowed the defense to insist that all the prosecution's conclusions about Jeffrey's involvement in the crime were wrong, and that the murderers were hippie outsiders. Jeffrey was a decent family man, a loving father and husband, and a professional in his field. Thus, he found many supporters, even at his workplace, who supported him and did not believe the man was guilty. The military member had no single motive or reason for the murder, and no one believed he could have injured himself so severely to stage a murder while he was in the crosshairs of death. Even Colette's stepfather, named Freddie KB, was so outraged that he launched an official campaign nationwide to prove Jeffrey's innocence. At the same time, an article appeared condemning the military justice for keeping the hearings closed to the public and the media. However, this did not help in any way, and the conduct of the trial remained behind the scenes, where more and more evidence of the investigators' incompetence was presented. Indeed, the investigation was conducted very negligently. The ambulance driver moved things in the house and even managed to steal the suspect's wallet right in front of the arriving police officers. The main perpetrator damaged some evidence during the transport of the bodies. No fingerprints or hair samples were taken from the victims to compare them with other evidence at the crime scene. The fingerprints on Kristen's phone, the baby bottle, and other items were completely eliminated. Practically everyone involved in the investigation was new and behaved unprofessionally. The list of uncovered irregularities grew longer with every minute of questioning the investigation participants. Coincidentally, the investigators received a clue about the young woman they met in the rain on the street, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Her name was Helena Stockley. It turned out that she was the daughter of a retired Army officer with an unenviable criminal record and a connection to the underworld. Helena turned out to be a police informant, but she also became a real activist of the hippie culture and was involved in the sale of illegal substances for many years. The police officers spoke with Helena and learned many valuable pieces of information about her environment. Unfortunately, serious irregularities also occurred during the interrogation, especially since the investigator did not turn on the recording of the conversation so that it could be shown to the judge during the trial. During the hearing, the inexperienced investigator claimed that the investigations into Helena's involvement were not yet complete. However, the situation escalated to the point that the investigators simply did not know where she was. She had run away. As everyone became aware of the full extent of the incompetence of the Army investigation, it seemed necessary to start the investigation anew in every respect. Nevertheless, the military leadership kept the hearing secret from the media. One of the police officers, however, decided to inform the journalists about the inadequacies of the military commission. This led to even more anger, which the military leadership took out on Jeffrey, who was trying to prove their case. Everyone around him was convinced of his innocence, except for the military commission, which refused to acknowledge his incompetence. Unfortunately, the military had much power in their hands, and they did not want to give in. They believed that Jeffrey, although there was no strong motive for the crime, might have taken substances that could trigger aggression and lead to a murder. Contrary to the prosecution, witnesses testified that Jeffrey was a reliable husband and a loving father. These defense witness statements were overwhelming. Moreover, the man was in a completely weak state at the time of the massacre. Only a small concentration of alcohol was detected in his blood, which could not significantly influence Jeffrey's behavior and lead him to commit crazy acts. Among the witnesses were not only friends and family members who wanted to support the man, but also real experts, c.g., psychiatrists. They conducted an examination and claimed that Jeffrey did not possess traits that could lead to such a murder of family members. Even the civil police were convinced of Jeffrey's innocence, as there was a lack of evidence and a motive. His mother had to sell her house to pay the lawyers. This time, the charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence, which did not prevent the military commission from investigating again later. The military police even swore that they would continue their campaign to convict Captain MacDonald at any cost. In their opinion, the mistakes in their work were not so serious and had no significant impact on the outcome. They believed that Jeffrey was the guilty party. At the same time, Jeffrey submitted a dismissal report because he was completely disillusioned with the U.S. Army. Jeffrey began his campaign to expose the armed forces through the media. Unfortunately, he had no idea how powerful his enemies really were and how much danger he was putting himself in. At this point, Helena Stockley was discovered by the police. She told several people that she might have actually witnessed the murder of the MacDonald family committed by her friends. The woman was ready to testify in court and tried to obtain immunity. Her statements were tested with a lie detector and proved to be true. Nevertheless, the military leadership wanted to hear nothing about the other suspects, but focused entirely on Jeffrey and prepared a new indictment against him. In the summer of 1971, Jeffrey and his friend traveled to Long Beach in California, where he wanted to start his life anew without suspecting that a conspiracy was brewing against him. They took a job in the emergency room of a medical center. Thanks to their dedication, the department became the best in the entire facility. Jeffrey's professional qualities were highly valued and were reflected, among other things, in the publications of medical journals. Jeffrey also became an activist against child abuse. Unfortunately, the military police remembered all the time that he had escaped an undeserved punishment and exposed the armed forces. In 1974, a new theory about Jeffrey was put forward. The military prosecutor's office gained insight into his psychiatric reports. The prosecutor's office received them only under the condition that Dr. MacDonald appear in court simultaneously with the disclosure of the contents of the documents. Of course, the prosecutor's office did not adhere to its part of the agreement as part of the impending conspiracy. Jeff had to undergo a truth serum test, which was illegal. No charges were filed without waiting for an answer from Jeffrey. He was indicted again, and the trial was set for mid-1979. A campaign was launched to tarnish his name. It was a high-profile case, and from the beginning, everything was against MacDonald. But the defense campaign at that time had no idea, and people from the highest ranks of the government rallied against the former captain of the armed forces. Deputy U.S. Attorney James Blackburn wanted to use the case as a stepping stone for his career. Later, he was found guilty of forgery, fraud, and embezzlement. But when the triple murder case was retried, his reputation was still untarnished. The deputy prosecutor took the cover-up to a whole new level. He had evidence proving the defendant's innocence, but of course, it was in his interest not to let it reach the defense team. As a result, all this evidence was hidden from the defense lawyers, who were not even allowed to examine the collected evidence themselves or familiarize themselves with the file. All this was achieved only with the help of the judge, who was clearly on the side of the prosecution. Any evidence of the defendant's innocence was either not admitted in front of the jury or strictly withheld from Jeffrey's lawyers. For example, new Heller fibers resembling a hair were found in Collett's hand. According to the prosecution, it was a tuft plucked from the head of the daughter's doll. In reality, they belonged to Helena Stockley, as she wore a blonde wig that night, which she took off immediately after the massacre. Jeffrey's hairs were also found in Collett's hand, but since he lived there and revived her, the presence of the hairs in her hand is understandable and could be a coincidence that does not indicate his guilt. Skin particles were found under her fingernails, which definitely did not come from Jeffrey and were identified as traces of the perpetrators. However, they were never analyzed and later found to be missing. All this was diligently ignored during the trial, as well as dozens of other evidence of Jeffrey's innocence. One of the most important accusations on which the prosecution based its judgment was the pajama fibers found on the ice pick. According to the prosecution, this tool was used to kill Collett and the children. They said that the ice pick left several pieces of fabric from the clothes the officers found Jeffrey in on the night of the triple murder. Years later, it turned out that these claims were false. In fact, several black fibers were found on the ice pick that matched those on Collett's body, but did not match any of the clothing pieces in the MacDonald house. The prosecution formulated this information so that the widow could be considered the perpetrator. Candle wax droplets were found at the scene of the massacre that did not match any of the 14 candles found in the victim's house. However, they were identical to those used by Helena Stockley in her rituals. The woman considered herself a witch and practiced witchcraft. Jeffrey saw the candle she held in her hand on the night of the attack, but his face was blood-smeared, and he could not see well because of his injuries, so he could not say with certainty whether Helena was holding a lantern or a candle. Even the ice pick itself, which was the murder weapon, raised many questions. Until the year 79, the main witnesses in this case, namely a relative of the victim and the family's nanny, claimed that there was no such tool in the MacDonald house. After long talks with the prosecution, however, they suddenly changed their statement. Also, the blood on Jeffrey's pajamas raised questions. The prosecution's expert argued that the arrangement of the stains indicated that it was the spouse who had fought with Collett. However, after documents about the trial were published, it turned out that this was also a lie. In court, an experiment was even conducted with a mannequin into which metal rods were inserted, whose positions matched Collett's wounds. MacDonald's pajamas were held against these rods, and it turned out that some of the stains matched in their position, but not all. The prosecution considered this to be clear evidence of the man's guilt, but the defender was able to prove that most of the stains did not match. Nevertheless, the experiment became one of the strongest pieces of evidence of the defendant's guilt. Another strong claim of the prosecution was the story that fibers from her husband's pajamas were found in Ket's hair. However, this later turned out to be untrue because the defense knew nothing about it before the hearing, and Jeffy's lawyer could not refute the claims in time. Another false statement was the information about blue footprints found on the couple's bedding. The prosecution believed they showed how the husband had dragged his wife's body. Later, it turned out that none of the described bloody footprints existed. Also, the prosecution was not aware of certain information at the time of the trial, especially that Helena Stockley had turned to the FBI in the 78s and reported that she had been involved in a triple murder. During that time, she was being treated in a hospital for depression and suicidal thoughts. At the trial, the woman said that on the day of the massacre, she was with her friend Greg Mitchell and some soldiers from Fort Bragg. They had all consumed something and, as she said, lost control. Helena said she called the McDonald's house late at night to make sure all family members were present. She could not remember the further events. Unfortunately, the military police also came to her, and the woman was so intimidated that at her second trial, Helena could not say what she had done between midnight and 5 a.m. However, she admitted to owning such a hat and a blonde wig, which were later burned because they could be used as evidence against her. Witnesses at the trial testified that Helena was present during the massacre. She stood with a candle and whispered some nonsensical incantations, but did not kill any member of the McDonald family herself. When her friends came to the children, she became weak and fled the house. It was speculated that the murder was committed for a specific reason. Helena's friends actually had a motive: revenge. The soldiers wanted to punish Dr. Jeffrey for banning them from taking substances, controlling the tests, and not issuing prescriptions for prohibited medications. These were soldiers who had returned from Vietnam and were addicted. Naturally, all this information was carefully hidden from Jeffrey's defenders. Helena Stockley was interrogated 3 times successfully, and her statement was confirmed. Nevertheless, her statement was classified as unreliable. The judge imposed restrictions on the disclosure of information about the woman and her accomplices, which was one of the obstacles for Jeffrey's defenders. The defense relied on the psychological profile and the innocence of the accused to convince the jury of his inability to commit a murder. The judge allowed the use of previously collected data, but only if Jeffrey underwent further examination by a psychiatrist of the prosecution. This was, of course, a trap. As it turned out, this specialist had worked with the military prosecutor's office throughout the 8-year investigation, which wanted to put Jeffrey behind bars forever. Indeed, after a brief interrogation, the doctor concluded that he was dealing with a murderous psychopath. Ultimately, the court did not allow the use of a psychological profile of Jeffrey previously created by another psychiatrist, which could have rehabilitated him in the eyes of the experts. Nevertheless, the new report was presented, which had devastating consequences for the defense. The prosecution managed to replace the beautiful image of Jeffrey with that of a real monster, and the judge, with these findings, betrayed the inviolability of the law. Naturally, the jury found Jeffrey guilty of the murder of his wife and 2 children, sentencing him to 3 life sentences. Surprisingly, however, the revenge of the leadership of the military police was not yet over. After it became known that the soldiers from Fort Bragg actually had serious problems with illegal substances, many who returned from Vietnam turned out to be addicted. The leadership of the unit was not prepared to deal with such problems. All this coincided with the emergence of the hippie movement, which actively developed in the 60s and 70s and worsened even more. Jeffrey was against prohibition and tried in every possible way to make it difficult for the soldiers to access substances, which caused outrage. Later, a group of people came together who wanted to pay Jeffrey a deadly visit. Helena's guilt could really not be doubted. Even her husband, whom she had married in the 80s, testified to her involvement. Her husband believed that Helena had not killed anyone, but was certainly a witness or even an accomplice to the crime. She told many details from the crime scene that had not yet been published, and that she could only have known because she was in the McDonald house that fateful night. Helena was interrogated 3 times, and her story that she was in the house was confirmed. Her statement was later recorded on video, where she said that the perpetrators forced Jeffrey to issue a prescription for medications when they entered the McDonald house, but he stubbornly refused, which led to a fight in which family members were killed, and he survived as a martyr. The perpetrators wrote "Death to all pigs" on the wall, probably wanting to emulate Charles Manson, who was very popular at that time. Helena died at the age of 30 from complications of a liver disease in '82. Her statement on camera could, however, be used in court with the judge's permission. Helena's friend Greg Mitchell was a 19-year-old soldier at the time of the triple murder who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, which caused him great distress. He had recently returned from Vietnam and was one of the few who wanted to return to the war to endure the horrors he had experienced. He began actively using illegal substances and was sent back to Vietnam after being discharged in '71 for his addiction. He confessed to a friend that he had been involved in the murder of his family. There were also several eyewitnesses to his prayers as he murdered numerous children. Numerous pieces of evidence were also found linking him to the crime scene, including his blood and hair. He was left-handed, and an independent expert believed that the stab wounds were inflicted with a left hand. However, he met a fate similar to Helena's. He died at the age of 32, also from liver problems, and could no longer testify in court. One of the biggest mistakes of Jeffrey McDonald was his friend with the writer Joe McGinn. They met shortly before the reopening of the proceedings, and Jeffrey suggested writing a book about the case. According to the defendant, this could be a trump card in his sleeve for the upcoming hearings. Jeffrey let Joe in on all the details of the trial and allowed him to attend all the sessions. In return, he received part of the publisher's advance for the book and waived any claims against the author for the purpose of the book. The friendship between the 2 men grew closer. The writer lived with him, and they ate, drank, and played together. For 3 years, Joe supported Jeffrey and encouraged him to continue defending the doctor's innocence. Finally, Joe betrayed him and described him in the book as a real monster. From private conversations, the author of the book learned that Jeffrey had taken diet pills shortly before the triple murder, a then quite strong substance. It was a one-time intake, but the author described it as if Jeffrey had taken the medication 3 times a day, which could have led to a severe overdose. According to the author, this was the reason for his anger and his retaliations against family members. Joe also found an excuse. It was known that his daughter had wet his side of the bed. Of course, a father in a normal family would not get angry about this, but Joe described this event as the reason why the supposedly loving family father snapped. According to Joe, in connection with the effects of the medications, Jeffrey developed a psychosis and killed the entire family. Even though Jeffrey's blood was tested on the day of the triple murder, the toxicological test revealed no other chemical substances besides a minimal amount of alcohol from the liquor. Joe claimed he had changed his mind about Jeffrey's guilt during the trial. In fact, it was a financially better decision for him. The controversial book was distributed in thousands of copies, enjoyed great popularity, and brought the author millions, and the distorted facts described in it severely damaged Jeffrey's reputation. From that moment on, the number of people who believed in his innocence significantly decreased. Fortunately, Jeffrey was able to sue the author of the book for defamation, as many of the facts were indeed strongly distorted. In August '84, a lawsuit was filed, demanding several $1 million in compensation from the author. After several hearings, Jeffrey finally agreed to a much lower sum of $325,000. Most of the compensation was deposited into a trust fund, but Jeffrey retained the right to continue his fight for justice against the writer. Jeffrey's story touches many. Several prominent lawyers who believed in him and wanted to help work pro bono to exonerate him. Nevertheless, one appeal after another was rejected. In '90, new reasons for a reopening of the proceedings and a review of the court decision emerged. Many pieces of evidence of Jeffrey's non-involvement in the triple murder were uncovered, including the results of forensic examinations. Unfortunately, the trial was again led by the same judge who continued to corner the defenders, as he was never impartial in this case. Ultimately, the case was advanced only in '97 when the defenders could prove that much of the information from witnesses and the prosecution was false. The big breakthrough during this time was the advent of new technologies for DNA tests, and Jeffrey's defense team was able to conduct tests. Unfortunately, the judge constantly hindered the defenders from achieving justice even in this phase. Finally, information about Helena Stokely came to light. A video of her testimony was made available to the defenders. At this point, the wrongfully convicted Jeffrey had already spent 2 decades in prison, but he did not stop fighting. The military prosecutor's office continued to relentlessly deny all new facts. New witnesses were found who were intimidated or otherwise swayed to the side of the prosecution. One of them stated that he had heard how Helena Stokely confessed her presence in the McDonald's house during the murders to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor had threatened her with prosecution if she testified as a witness for the defense. Thus, he forced her to remain silent. Eventually, Prosecutor Blackburn was involved in a series of crimes, including forgery, theft, and embezzlement, and he was imprisoned. In January 2006, new evidence and the possibility of a new trial emerged. First, a video of Helena Stokely's confession was released, and then evidence supporting her words based on DNA tests became publicly available. Hair and tissue found on the victims' bodies were analyzed and found to come from unknown individuals. In March 2006, another important episode occurred in the case. A man reported to the police that he had drunk several times in a bar with a man who confessed to having been involved in the massacre of the McDonald family. This happened between the 80s and '82. The drinking partner of the new witness turned out to be Gregory Mitchell, Helena's friend. The last time he heard details of the crime was 14 days before Greg's death. The cashier of the 7-Eleven store near Jeffrey's house claimed he had seen a group of hippies enter the store the morning after the murder. They looked unkempt, were blood-stained, and talked about the crime they had committed. However, he kept silent about the conversation because he was afraid for his life at the time. He was threatened. He recognized Greg and Helena in the group. An employee of the rehabilitation center, where Greg Mitchell was treated, also testified that he had repeatedly confessed to her the murder of Jeffrey's wife and his children, and had also written confessions on the walls of the center. However, all this evidence was ignored by the court. 54 years have passed since the brutal massacre of an innocent woman and 2 children. Jeffrey's defenders are still clinging to the possibility of proving his innocence by filing an appeal. The last time the man tried to appeal against his sentence was in 2021, but the appeal was denied. Jeffrey's life continues behind prison bars. He still does not give up and sincerely hopes that he will still have the opportunity to breathe the air of freedom. While he was behind bars, he met one of the innocence activists, Catherine Curid. A relationship developed between them. The woman visited him, and they became so close that they got married. Catherine runs a website for Jeffrey's case and is committed with all her might to the man's release. The 80-year-old Jeffrey, who has spent most of his life behind bars, claims that the real perpetrators have gone unpunished. They have already lived their lives. Some are dead and have not had to answer for their atrocities. Thank you for watching, and take care.